Well, if you're new with us, we are in a series through the Gospel of Mark in our Bibles, a series that we are calling Follow Me. And in light of that, I want to invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. Mark 6, 45 through 52. And if you need a Bible this morning, there are several Bibles provided for you there in the seat backs in front of you, so feel free to use one of those Bibles. And if you are using one of those copies, you'll find this morning's passage on page 842. Page 842. Join me as I read this morning's passage straightway through before we dive into this morning's message. Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them, and he said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. You know, reading this morning's passage might feel a bit like deja vu. And that's because this is actually the second time in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus calms a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Did you notice that? This is actually the second time that Jesus does something like this, showing the magnitude of his power over creation. And so we might think, as we read this story, that this repetition is unusual, until we realize that so much of the disciples' lives revolved around the Sea of Galilee. Like, if you think about it, these guys were from the towns right there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, right? Many of them were fishermen, and that means that they spent most of their waking hours on that very lake. And so, on second thought, it makes all the sense in the world, doesn't it? It makes all the sense in the world that if Jesus wanted to teach these disciples about who he is and what it means to trust him, he would do so on the Sea of Galilee, okay? It's like Jesus is performing these miracles in the workplace of their everyday life. Now, last time Jesus calmed a raging storm on the Sea of Galilee, remember, it was back in Mark chapter 4. Last time I made the case to you that this is not just a story that's about physical storms. These are stories that are meant to show us something about the storms of life and how God interacts with us in the storms of life. We talked about the fact that even in a room like this, as we look around, we think about all the kinds of things that we might be going through. Some of us going through medical storms. Some of us going through relational storms of various kinds. Maybe some going through emotional storms or moral storms. Trials, frustrating situations of all kinds. Ironically, since preaching that text back in Mark 4, since that time, we've had devastating tornadoes all over the news, haven't we? I think of those tornadoes that leveled entire communities in Mississippi, and then even this past weekend, we had more tornadoes that blew through the Midwest and the South. And as you turn on the news, you see these physical storms. There's been physical storms since I preached that last message on Mark chapter 4. And yet in a room like this, there's been a lot of other life storms, hasn't there? Even since we preached that last message. I wonder what you've gone through. I wonder what you are going through. I wonder what kind of life situations and struggles and pains and trials you might be facing in your life, even this very morning. Listen, I wonder if Mark includes not just one, but two stories of Jesus taming storms on the Sea of Galilee, not only because both of these events actually happened in real history, but also because we need to see once again who Jesus is in the middle of the storms of life. It's almost like Mark wants to say to us in this account, this lesson never gets old. We need to see it all over again. Who is Jesus in the middle of life's storms? In fact, in this morning's passage, Jesus shows us what he does in the middle of the storms of life. Do you realize, brothers and sisters, that in whatever you're going through, Jesus is not passive. Jesus Christ is active with you in what you face. Jesus does things in our storms, and specifically this morning, I want you to see Jesus does two things. Jesus meets us in the storm, and Jesus reveals himself in the storm. Those 2 points this morning as we work our way through the passage. Let's take a look. First of all, number one, Jesus meets us in the storm. Pick it up at verse 45. We read, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. I would remind you that in the account immediately prior to today's text, Jesus had just done an extraordinary miracle. He had just fed 5,000 men, plus women and children, with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And listen, if Jesus was planning to be a political revolutionary, now would be the time to hit the gas and leverage the fervor of these crowds and make it happen. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, we see that he puts the disciples into a boat, sends them across the way, disperses the crowds, goes up onto a mountain, so that presumably he can spend time in prayer before the Father, recalibrating and refocusing on his true mission. And during this time, Jesus is praying. The disciples begin to struggle, don't they? Verse 47, look there. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. As you know, the Sea of Galilee is notorious for sudden, gusty storms. And that's because of high altitude air in the surrounding mountains that comes down and collides with the low altitude air at the face of the sea, 700 feet below sea level. And so one of these windy storms blows in, and the text tells us the disciples were making headway painfully. Literally, we could translate the text that they were being tormented in their progress as they rode against those winds. They are panicked, they are helpless, they are exhausted. Picture waves crashing over the sides of the boat. Everybody's barking orders to one another. Everything's in disarray. There is sheer frustration as they row, and they row, getting nowhere. Apparently, they're rowing for pretty much the whole evening, well into the night, into the early morning, rowing, getting nowhere. And somehow we read that Jesus sees them. Did you notice that? In verse 48, it says that Jesus saw that they were struggling. We know that it was the 4th watch of the night. That's a Roman calculation of time. That would have been between 3 and 6 a.m. And so perhaps Jesus sees them in the light of very early dawn, or perhaps Jesus sees them with his supernatural insight. Either way you take it this morning, Jesus sees them, and then he goes out to meet them. Now, right here, I want to point something out that's very important. Did you notice? Jesus didn't have to go into the storm in order to address the disciples' problem. He could have addressed this problem a different way, from a distance, without getting inside the storm. Like, Jesus could have stood on the shore and just simply said, wind and waves, be still. And we know what? They would have been still, right? Because that's exactly what he did earlier in the earlier storm story. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus could have managed this problem from a distance. He heals from a distance. Certainly he could have sent some power to his disciples and strengthened them from a distance. Look, Jesus could have sent out a memo for like 10,000 angels. Guys, get out there. The disciples need a little bit of help. Go lend a hand. He could have solved this by proxy through angelic help. But he doesn't do that, does he? Let me ask you, what does Jesus do? Notice this. What does he do? He walks in, doesn't he? Jesus goes into the storm and gets soaked. He feels the wind and spray against his face. Jesus enters into the turmoil that the disciples are facing. Jesus meets them inside their dilemma. That's what I want you to notice. And not only that, but Jesus goes into the storm in a very unusual way. You say, what way is that? Well, he walks on water. Last time I checked, people don't walk on water. That doesn't work. Maybe it works for those little bugs, that can do that little thing they do. It doesn't work for people, does it? I've tested it out. It doesn't work. I have this vague memory of being like 7 or 8 years old and testing this out. I was going to see if could you walk on water, there by the side of the swimming pool, stepping way back from the edge, running as fast as I could out onto the water, my legs scrambling. 100% of the time, I sank like a bag of rocks, okay? It doesn't work. No, Jesus does a miracle, doesn't he? He does a miracle here. Jesus walking on water is textbook miracle, plain and simple. Now, secular scholars have come up with all kinds of alternative theories about what happened here. And you'll read them and some will say, well, what happened was that the sea was actually just misty and so everybody thought he was walking on water, but it wasn't really what was happening. Or others will say, well, what happened here was that it was a sandbar that went out into the water. And so Jesus is walking on a sandbar, and it just kind of looks like he's walking on the sea, and everybody was kind of tricked and fooled to believe that. The problem with modern scholars and all of their theories is that they discount the actual text. The grammar in the sentence can't be read any other way. Mark records that Jesus walked on the sea. And Mark is our original source. Like, he records the facts as he knows them to be. And his facts came from eyewitnesses, almost certainly from the Apostle Peter, as we covered in prior messages. And so here's the thing, assuming that we do believe Mark, and assuming, therefore, that we believe that this really happened, here's the question that I want to ask you this morning. Why does Jesus walk on water to meet the disciples that day on the raging sea? Why? Why walk on water? There's other ways he could have gone out to help them. He could have swum out there. Like, to swim that distance in choppy waters, that would have been miracle enough. He could have gotten to his own personal Jesus boat and go out there and help them out that way. That also would have been impressive, but he doesn't do that. He walks on water. Why does Jesus walk on the water? As I've said, Jesus never does miracles for the sake of miracles, just to say, look what I can do. No, he always has a reason. He's always showing something, revealing something, teaching something to us. So what is Jesus teaching us as he goes into the storm and walks on the water? Here's what I think Jesus is teaching us, right? I suggest to you this morning that Jesus goes into the storm in such a way that he is showing us that he is fully in charge of the storm the whole time. He's walking on this water, right? So Jesus is coming into the storm, but he's also sovereign over the storm the entire time. And this is a powerful lesson for the disciples. Can you even imagine their situation? There they are, struggling against the oars. Here comes their Lord. Here comes Jesus, empathetic enough to see their plight and come inside the storm with them. And yet he's walking on water. He's totally in control the whole time. He's with them, but he's in control. It reminds us today that as disciples of Jesus, where you and I are often straining at the oars of life, right? We need to remember, we need to learn here that Jesus enters into our storms, and he is with us in our struggle. By his Spirit, he is present with us, isn't he? And yet he is sovereign over each and every situation. He is literally walking on water right in the middle of whatever storms you face this morning, brothers and sisters. It reminds me of the time when Jesus wept with Mary and Martha about their brother Lazarus who had died. Do you remember the story? There's Jesus. He's with Mary. He's with Martha. They're in this storm because their brother has died. He's in the grave. And here's Jesus. We really explicitly read in the text that Jesus wept. And yet, we know as readers of that story that Jesus is in control the whole time, isn't he? He's walking on water, as it were. Like, Jesus knows he's about to raise Lazarus back to life. And yet, even though he knows all of that, even though he's perfectly in control, he's still weeping with Mary and with Martha, isn't he? And there's a reality there that we need to see today in whatever storms we're facing. Let me ask you again. Let me just have each of you, as you hear this, think about your own situation. What storms are you going through? Big things and small. What are you navigating today? Relational and emotional pain, perhaps. Maybe the fight against sin is long and hard for you. Maybe you're facing difficult decisions in your life. You're trying to figure out what to do next, and it's very confusing. Maybe you're facing sickness. Maybe you're facing frailty. Maybe you're even facing the reality of death. Whatever the storm or storms are that you are facing today, brothers and sisters, I want you to remember this, that Jesus wants to meet you in your storm. He's not standing back just trying to solve your problem from a distance. No, he comes inside with you. He's present with you. He's close to you by his Spirit. He's with you in your pain. His heart empathizes with you. But at the same time, he's also in charge in the middle of your storm, isn't it? Isn't he? He's walking on water, and you can rest in that fact today. Now, here's another thing that I want you to see before we move on to our next point. I think the fact that Jesus comes into the storm, even while he's walking on the water, is also a picture of the Christian gospel. It's like a visual illustration of the message of the gospel. You say, please explain. Well, think about it. The gospel is the good news that God sends his son Jesus into the storm of our sinful and broken world. Jesus enters into the human condition, lives a human life, and goes all the way to the cross where he dies to rescue sinners from the judgment that we deserve. And there on the cross, he is literally in the storm clouds of the wrath of God that we deserve because of our sin. And yet here's the thing. On that cross, Jesus is still in control. Do you realize that? It's like he's walking on water. Jesus himself said, no man takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. And on that cross, he was actually displaying his victory, right? He went into the grave, and on that third day, he rose again, conquering death, in complete victory, and now he offers forgiveness and life to all those who would put their trust in him. So the gospel message is this message that God in Christ went into the storm, and in the middle of it all, he was powerful enough to save us from the storm. Look, if you're here today and you're not a Christian, I hope that you would consider just how unique the Christian gospel message really is compared to other religions of the world, compared to other worldviews. Listen, only with Christianity do you get a God who, on the one hand, is fully empathetic with us and all that we go through. A God who will literally send his son into the storm. And at the same time, only with Christianity do you have a God who is fully in control of the storm, powerful enough to save us. So with Jesus Christ, consider this. In Jesus, you have both the empathy of God and the power of God to save, and they are both put together in him. So consider Jesus. If you come to Jesus, on the one hand, you know that he understands you. He's empathetic with you. But on the other hand, you know he has the power to save you. He can walk on water. All right, so what is Jesus doing when the storms of life rage? First of all, we've seen Jesus meets us in the storm. But secondly, I want you to see this morning that Jesus also reveals himself in the storm. He reveals himself in the storm. Let's pick it up and read again halfway through verse 48. We read that he meant to pass by them. Interesting. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. And they cried out, for they saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Can I ask you, did you notice the most curious phrase there in verse 48? It says, Jesus meant to pass by them. Isn't that weird? Strike anybody else as odd? Like the whole reason Jesus was going into the storm was to rescue the disciples. And so why do we read in the text that Jesus intentionally means to pass by the disciples? Well, there is an answer. The answer, I believe, is rooted in the Old Testament. Jesus is dramatically illustrating the appearance of God's glory for the disciples to see. Let me explain. Think back with me to the time of Moses. Remember that Moses asked God to see his glory. Moses said, "God, show me your glory." Remember that? But what does God tell Moses? God tells Moses, "You can't see my glory directly. That would undo you. In fact, no one can see my face and live. But," God says, "I will allow you to see my back." And so God tells Moses that he should go hide himself in the crack of a rock. And then God says, and I quote from Exodus 33:19, God says, "I will make all my goodness pass before you." Notice I've underlined that on the screen. "Pass before you, and will proclaim my name, the Lord." So this was a theophany. This was a revelation of God's glory, right? It was a visual appearance of God's glory. And so, if you read the story, Moses does hide himself in that rock, and God comes and passes by in all of his glory, revealing it and proclaiming his name, and Moses is hidden. And then after God passes by, Moses is allowed to look out and peek out and view something of the afterglow of God's back, as it were. Well, in light of that passage, now we read in Mark's account that as Jesus came walking on the water, he meant to pass by them. See the same phrase underlined? Jesus is illustrating to his disciples that he is the fully divine Lord who passes by. Jesus reveals the glory of God. Bible scholar David Garland says it so well. He says, quote, "The disciples see more than God's back, as Moses did. They saw the face of God in the face of his Son." Indeed, Jesus, in this story, is revealing his full divinity. He's fully God. This is confirmed when we consider that in the Old Testament, in a number of places, it was God who walked on the sea. For instance, Job 9, verse 8 says, God alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. And then here is Jesus, right? Walking on the sea. He is God alone. That's the message. And look, if these clues don't convince you yet, consider this. Think back to Exodus chapter 3, where Moses is speaking with God, or rather God is speaking to Moses out of that burning bush. You remember that story? And God reveals his name to Moses. And God says this. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Exodus 3, verse 24. As I've underlined there in that verse, God's name is I am. It's actually a verb in Hebrew that God converts to his name. His name is I am. And this name, I am, captures something of the very character and being of God in that very name. The name I am says something about God's eternal nature, his unchanging transcendence, his sovereignty. This name I am speaks to God's self-sufficiency and God's independence and his self-determining nature. He will, some have translated, I will be who I will be. God will be who he will be. He is the great I am. Now, look what Jesus says to the disciples in our text down in verse 50 when they see him there and they think that he's a ghost. And we read, he spoke to them and said, take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. The English Standard Version translates the phrase, it is I. But I want you to know that in Greek, we could literally translate this phrase, I am. It's ego eimi in Greek. Jesus is proclaiming himself to be, I am. Could it be more clear? Jesus passed by like God revealed. He walks on water like only God can do. And then he uses God's sacred name for himself. He is the great I am. It is no wonder that the disciples shouldn't be afraid, because God had just come to them in the middle of their storm. And they should have recognized that. But when Jesus gets into the boat and the wind ceases, yet another miracle, by the way. And when we read in verses 51 through 52, they were utterly astounded because we read they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. It's not that the disciples didn't understand that Jesus had done miracles, that he had fed 5,000 people, that he had just walked on water. They understood that he had done these miracles, but what they were missing, what they were failing to grasp, is the significance of those miracles. The bread miracle and the water miracle should have connected all kinds of dots in their mind about the story of Moses and how God had revealed his name and how God had parted those waters, how God had fed the people with manna. But here, Jesus is not just another prophet like Moses. No, Jesus is the very God that Moses worshiped and served. Jesus is the great I am. And here's what I want you to see. The storm was the perfect opportunity for Jesus to reveal all of this. The storm was an opportunity. Think about it. Jesus comes into the storm, walks on water, passes by, declares his name, I am. It was the perfect opportunity to see who Jesus really is as God. And the story reminds us today that storms are an opportunity. Storms are an opportunity to see who Jesus really is. I wonder, do you view storms in your life that way, as an opportunity? I know I often don't. But if you think about it, the disciples would never have had the opportunity to watch Jesus walking on water unless he had allowed them to get out there in that raging storm. They never would have seen Jesus displaying his glory and divinity in the way he does if Jesus hadn't let them struggle at the oars all night. These same things are true for us as disciples this morning, brothers and sisters. Storms are an opportunity. God often reveals his character to us in ways that we could never see unless he allowed us to go through storms and through trials and through pain and through frustration. Let me ask you by way of example, how would you know that God is faithful unless he allowed you into situations where you were forced to trust his promises? How would you know about the relentless mercy of Christ if it weren't for the fact that so often Christ himself allows us to make a mess of things so that it's loud and clear we need his mercy? And we cry out for it afresh. Come to think of it, how would we know that Jesus is strong if he didn't allow us into storms and situations where we feel extremely weak? How would you know the God of compassion who invites you to cast your cares upon him unless he put you into situations with heavy cares and burdens that you needed to bring? It's a counterintuitive way of looking at storms, isn't it? But it's that very turmoil that becomes an opportunity. You know, it's been said that if you want to see the stars, darkness is required. Well, if you want to see the brilliant character of Jesus, you have to brave some storms. Brothers and sisters, what does Jesus intend? I want to ask you this morning, what does Jesus intend to teach you about himself that you can only discover by going through your current storm? Which of God's perfections is he trying to display for you to see as you navigate whatever you're facing even this morning? The tragedy in our story today is that the disciples failed to see what they were supposed to see, namely that Jesus is the great I am. And the lesson is this: don't waste your storms. The storms are going to come in life. Don't waste your storms. Allow every struggle, every trial, every temptation, every dilemma to show you more and more and more of the faithfulness and character of the Lord Jesus Christ, our Lord God. You know, Jesus is in the business of revealing himself in life storms. So what's he trying to help you see as you go through yours? Can I make a recommendation for lunch today? Not a recommendation for where you're going to go to lunch, but a recommendation for what to talk about during lunch. By the way, in the first hour, I recommended that they all go to Chick-fil-A today. They didn't think that was a very nice joke, but over lunch, whoever you eat with and share table fellowship with this afternoon, can I recommend this? Take some time, go around the table, and just ask people at your table, what storms have you gone through recently in your life? And what did you learn about God as a result of that storm? That's a really great question. And I think that what you'll discover is that not only does God want to teach each of us individually through our own storms, but he also wants us to see lessons as we hear about other people's storms as well. He is a faithful God who reveals himself there. Well, we should conclude. Repetition is key to learning, is it not? Repetition is key to learning. Malcolm Gladwell says that you need 10,000 hours of practice before you can really master any given subject. Well, Jesus wants us to master the art of trusting him. And he's going to teach us that through repetition. Storm after storm after storm. It's no wonder that Mark gives us not one, but two storm miracles that took place on the Sea of Galilee. And that's because repetition is key. It's as if he wants to say to us, the storms of life are just going to keep coming and coming and coming. But will you trust Jesus? Will we trust him? Will we believe that he sees us in our struggle, that he enters into our pain, that he is with us by his Spirit, and yet he's sovereign over our storm? He's walking on water after all. Will we see who he really is? Will we view every storm as an opportunity to see more and more of his character? Brothers and sisters, Jesus, let me remind you, he is greater than Moses. Jesus is the great I am. He's the Lord of the storm, and he is all yours today, right now, for all that you face. What an encouragement. Be reminded, be encouraged, be strengthened.